So welcome. Today, I will be talking about conducting effective and equitable community engagement. So this is the agenda for today. I will do a brief introduction of myself and the work that I've done. I'll go through what equitable engagement is, why it is important, the differences between co-design and participatory processes, what we mean by those terms. And then I will talk about two case studies. First, Mi Taxi in Mexico City, which is a project that I worked on for my doctoral dissertation. And then another case study, the Future of Work Task Force in New Jersey, a project that the director of the lab where Hannah and I work directed. So Beth Novak was the director of that project. And then I would just go through some considerations when designing an engagement process. So many years ago, I actually trained as a graphic designer. My background is in graphic design. And I did a doctorate on the role of designers in government, in innovation labs, mainly in Mexico and Latin America. And I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. And starting in August, I'll transition into an assistant professor position. And so as a bit of a summary, for the last decade, I've worked on topics related to the use of design in the public sector as a creative approach to reframing public problems. And the work that I'm kind of the proudest of is the one that I've done either as a public servant myself, as a public worker myself, or in collaboration with public agencies. And so in a previous life, I was a public worker in the local government in Mexico City, and later in the federal government in the National Digital Strategy, also in Mexico. So I'm coming from a city of 22 million people, and I really see the public service as a place where we can have impact in people's everyday lives. It's a way of taking care of our neighbors, of our communities, of our cities, of our states. And when I started as a public worker, Mexico had many, many issues to deal with, like transportation and security problems or water scarcity, and it still has them. But at that time, I was really motivated to get involved in place-based solutions. It made me really interested in the diversity of lived experiences within the same city. And perhaps some of you have visited Mexico City. So the city center looks like the image on the left, but the southern part of the city is considered a rural area. And it looks like the image on the right of my slide. And it made me really think about how big of a challenge it is to develop public services that serve absolutely everyone and respond to very different lived experiences, and how to make the voices of those communities central to the development of those services heard and taken into consideration. So as a summary, this is my background as a designer working for the government, now in academia, researching what it means to integrate design methods in policy implementation. So with that context as a backdrop, I would like for us to discuss a little bit what equitable engagement means. And so for this, your participation in the chat will be crucial. So if you could define equitable engagement, what would that be? Please take 30 seconds to just think about it and write your definition on the chat. And I will look at some of them and read them out loud. So for that, I'll stop sharing my screen for a minute so that I can see the chat. Let's see. So it's Ana Maldonado says, flexible services for all, cultural competence for all, yes. Engagement that includes all the voices of the community and allows for a variety of ways that people can share their voice, absolutely. Jacob, engaging all affected stakeholders in a way that gives them equitable influence in the process. Yes, we'll talk about that equitable influence in the process in a few minutes. Juliet says, including all people involved, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, disability, neurodiversity. Yes, absolutely. Development of public services that centers perspectives, feedback, leadership of local communities. Yes. Active participation in your community through voting, community service, participation in local government. Those who are less advantaged, the ability to reach all members, to meet individualized needs. Yes, absolutely. These are great. Thank you so, so much. Just gonna go through some of the ones that are coming in. Equitable community engagement is ensuring that all individuals in the community have the resources and support so everyone has the same potential and opportunity. Absolutely. Allowing everyone to access a service regardless of background, meaning taking intentional action to alleviate, it moved, disadvantages such as social economic barriers. Yes, yes, absolutely. These are so, so great. Thank you. Outreach to all so that everyone can participate in the community. Yes. So there is a very kind of democratic component to community engagement, right? Where we are considering that everyone has the same rights to access public services and public programs and whatever it is that we are designing for, right? So we'll see how involvement and engagement can happen in different parts of a process. Thank you so much for your participation. So let me go back to my presentation. So again, the way that I approach it is as fair collaboration or fair participation, just as you all were saying in the chat. And you may ask yourselves, well, fair collaboration and fair participation in which context, right? So let's take, for example, a researcher, a policymaker, or a designer, right? They are trying to define or understand the problem, a social situation, to take action, to design something that responds to a need, or they're trying to mitigate a problem. So depending on their disciplinary background, the way that they are approaching a problem, personal experience, or even political views, they might approach the definition of that problem from a very particular stance. Sometimes expertise or personal assumptions may blind us from understanding the problem or situation from another perspective, from the perspective of the people impacted by the problem or who are in most need of a public service. So in order to have a more complete idea of what the problem is, or garner solutions, or understand the impact of a public service, it's important to get the point of view or opinion of the communities and people experiencing the issue firsthand, right? As well as from other relevant stakeholders, as some of you were mentioning. So basically, we want to research a problem or situation, and we want to complement it by including the perspective of relevant stakeholders, key actors, and then complement that with the perspective of the people experiencing the situation firsthand. So I think about it as a nested way of doing research. And so just, I was reading where people were connecting from, and I was just wondering, do you consider engagement important in the sort of work that you are doing currently? And if so, why or why not? And would love to read some of your answers out loud. Oops. And I'll stop sharing so that I can see the chat. Max says, can we please define engagement in this context? It's a very broad word. Yes, absolutely, Max. So when I talk about engagement or participation, it's direct contact with the communities that matter the most to our project. That can be local communities, that can be relevant stakeholders, and actually getting their input about a problem. So it may be defining a project or a problem together. It may be coming up with solutions together. Or it may be even evaluating programs together. I hope that is helpful, and I'll go through that in a minute as well. So I will just go through some of the answers. Rebecca is saying 100% engagement is crucial to transparency in public service. It's mandated in a lot of our processes, and even when it isn't, it's still a best practice. Yes, absolutely. It not only creates transparency, but it also creates sort of mechanisms for accountability, right? It's not the same to deal with kind of an institution than to deal with people, a face-to-face conversation with people putting together a service and people that will be receiving or on the other side of that service. Martha says we are doing a communities of practice, so it's important for lessons learned. Absolutely. Julianne says, for me, it's moving. I am working for the employees of the government, but employment engagement is important because without happy employees, the institution can't do its job well. Yes, absolutely. Ellen, yes, equitable engagement in housing and land development helps prevent gentrification. Yes, absolutely. Throughout vets, we work to connect unhoused veterans. I'm so sorry, it moved, and service members to employment resources and long-term housing. Yes, absolutely. So at the end of the day, Max says it is very important. I just came from the virtual DEIA symposium hosted by the Federal Aviation Administration. And this was a big topic. Speakers discuss how they gather statistics on DEIA issues and then try to go through those. I'm sorry, it's moving.
If you want, Sophia, it's not moving for me. I can read a few out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Yeah, so Max continues, and then try to go to those groups and discuss what they mean together when possible. Exactly. Joe says, yes, I'm working on immigration issues with USCIS. If migrant communities themselves cannot access or operate specific tools and pathways, that is a policy failure. Community engagement is key at every stage of the policy-making process to make sure policies meet the needs of communities they are designed for and ideally with. And IMI says yes, because if I don't understand the BG of jobs that might be centered around a dispute, my work can create bad law via uninformed, unrealistic decisions, i.e. understanding longshore jobs, equipment, or how different coal jobs work.
Yes, thank you so much for your replies. So what we're trying to do is kind of shorten that gap of understanding between what is happening inside of institutions and what's happening out there, right, in the real world, the way that people experience their everyday lives. Great, thank you. I'll go back to the presentation. So I myself consider it very important. And before I go deeper into why I think it's crucial to the work we do in the public sector, I would like to give you an example. So while working for the Mexican National Digital Strategy, I was asked to carry out a testing exercise in collaboration with the Ministry of Labor for a job offering seeking platform similar to a very famous private one that links people. So we went
so you won't tell me what closed in that month?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I need that too. It's like for that month, what's open and what's
I'll go ahead and mute the participant.
Perfect. Thank you, Hannah. So I'll just give it a second. Great. Thank you so much. So we went to the Ministry of Labor's office, the actual building, where there were a lot of people just doing in-person procedures. And some of these procedures take a while. So while people were waiting, we asked them to step into a room with computers and a set of instructions, like using the platform to find a job offering in the service industry. So please apply for that. Or post a job offering regarding a certain position. And after we did that exercise, we realized that from people's feedback, that the platform needed minor design tweaks. It was a pretty straightforward platform and it was very easy to use. But what it was missing was a very important component: jobs in the agricultural sector. So a few young men working in this sector told us, all the jobs in here are jobs that you'd find in a city. We work in the fields, but I have a phone and I have internet. So why wouldn't I want to use this platform in order to seek for temporary jobs or jobs that change from season to season? I would love to see offerings that allowed me to work in the harvest of avocados or the harvest of blackberries, right? So one of our main recommendations was the addition of that new section, as well as doing more research on how producers could post job openings easily. And so it is bringing to the spotlight the needs of a community that is as connected as anyone else in the country, but somehow, because of certain biases or the way that the platform was designed from a very central centralized institution, the Ministry of Labor is in Mexico City, a very, very urban space. They hadn't been taken into consideration, right, when developing the platform. So the reason why equitable engagement is important in the public sector is because in today's world, we are running into very complex social problems that are intertwined with ecological, political, economic problems. We cannot untangle them completely. And the big issue with these problems is that they are complex because different stakeholder groups see them differently. They define them even differently, and approach those solutions to those problems from very different angles. So there is a need to understand those different perspectives, to coordinate, to connect, and to respond to the needs of communities that have been systematically not been taken into account. It is especially important to do so in the public sector because our public institutions are the guardians of our common assets, our shared resources, and the protection of local residents' well-being. So these complex problems are interconnected. An ecological problem sprawls into a social or economic one that connects into a political one, and so on. And they cast a shadow on people's everyday lives, layering on top of each other. These problems are an umbrella. They are large and complex, but the way that they manifest is in local ways, shaping the everyday lives of communities. And that's why understanding those lived experiences is so important. So I think this cartoon sums up very well what I'm trying to articulate here. It is not one thing, but a complex combination of multiple problems that shape the lived experience of communities that are in most need. These are examples of problems that are incredibly complex and manifest in very vast and different ways, depending on the area or region of the country, of the United States, right? So the opioid overdose epidemic, for example, why is it that it has manifested in West Virginia so intensely? Or ecological problems, right? Climate change is real, but it manifests very differently in particular places, exacerbating already existing patterns. We've seen the wildfires in different areas of North America some weeks ago, with New York completely filled with smoke. And we see that also in other places of the world. Or contemporary consequences of public service provision, right? The existence of food deserts and other urban problems related to redlining in the early 20th century in American cities. So I would really, again, love to hear from you on how do you think that engagement or participation processes could be included as part of your current projects or internship? Is that a possibility? Is that something you're thinking of? Some of you started to put it on the chat, but I would love to hear more from the perspective of a kind of like set project for the summer. If you'd like to add that to the chat, and Hannah, if you could help me reading some of those, that'd be fantastic.
Of course, I'll start reading them as they come in.
Thank you.
Kent says, making data available to our citizens can motivate engagement.
Okay. And I would love to hear, how do you think that you could make data available to citizens? What are some ways that some of you have been thinking about that?
Time says engagement is at the core of what I am working on this summer. And for me, that means accessibility on all fronts. And Ken followed up by saying with an open data portal.
Yes, open data portals are great. Some other ways, Urban Institute has a method they developed called data walks that is fantastic, where it's basically the same, but in analog form, in order to make it accessible for communities that may not have the digital literacy to do so, to access like open data portals. So there's a couple of ways to do that.
Jacob says developing a performance management system for multiple offices within a federal agency. Other offices within the agency are stakeholders, but are not necessarily involved in creating performance measures and metrics. Juliet says, I'm looking into participation of people with disabilities in research and grant programs, particularly autistic researchers at IES, U.S. Department of Education. Some ways to make this available is to present at a conference on the data. Also, we are potentially making briefs for the public on the data. Sarah says, I'm working on reporting for the district offices. I can talk to those in the field to find out what data is most critical to them. As far as customer experiences goes, we can survey and speak to customers to determine any potential pain points. Rebecca says, I work mostly internally in my agency, but we still seek a lot of engagement from our offices across the agency, both from corporate and technical offices, as well as our regional offices. It's not external or public participation, but it's still essential engagement for what our office needs to be successful. Yes. Trudy says, our city is planning an RFP for the development of city-owned land later this year and would like to include community vision and values into the RFP to vet proposals and define success for the future development project. That's excellent. So we have a few more. Should I keep going?
Just perhaps one or two more, and then I'll continue.
Okay, so we have from Joe, USCIS is hosting Afghan support centers across the country this summer to help Afghan parolees apply for benefits and other immigration pathways at the local level. National public engagement leaders from the agency hold listening sessions with different groups of stakeholders at those events, e.g. local NGOs and Afghan clients. And finally, Nash says, I'm developing resources to educate water utilities about EJ and engagement in the context of planning for climate adaptation so that the adaptations they plan address community needs and climate threats. And we had some other excellent ones. So thank you for all entering what you're really working on this summer in this context.
Yes, thank you so much. It's so interesting and really important, really important work. Thank you for that. I always love to hear how people are engaging with communities they work for. So I want to shift gears a little and talk from a design perspective, because a lot of the times equitable engagement is also referred to as co-design. Perhaps some of you have heard this term before, or participatory processes, participatory design. So if you have heard these terms, if you have heard co-design, can you give me just a thumbs up and I can see it if I stop sharing my screen and I can see participants? Just a thumbs up, and that way I can, yeah, okay.
To find the thumbs up, you just have to go to the bottom of your screen and press reactions, and you'll see the thumbs up there.
Okay, some of you, perfect. Great. All right. So basically, these terms are very similar to our equitable engagement definition. They mean collaboration and participation, but there is a very subtle difference in practice that has a big impact in implementation. So when we talk about co-design, we are understanding the designer, researcher, public servant as one of the stakeholder groups defining the problem or developing a design or solution. The community at the front line of the issue will be another core stakeholder. And then there will be other key stakeholders. These could be other public agencies, academics, universities, activists, etc., nonprofits. In a co-design process, they all are at the same level. It's a non-hierarchical collaboration, and that is key. They all have the same input in the definition of a problem, in devising a solution or evaluating the results. And this requires a lot of trust and cooperation. Therefore, co-designing may be more time-consuming, and it may require more coordination and negotiation between the parties. So that may create a longer process.
Sophia, could you let us know if there's any difference or if this is some of the essential elements of human-centered design? Someone pointed this out in the chat.
Excellent question. Yes. So human-centered design, we may say that it's the same as design thinking, where we're really putting the users, the people that we're working for at the center of the process. And we have the main 5 steps, right? We empathize, we discover, ideate, prototype, and test. So those are the main 5 kind of steps for a design thinking or human-centered design process. But within those 5 steps, empathizing, discovering or doing research, ideating, prototyping, and testing or evaluating, implementing, we may have co-design or participation in all of those. So it's not the same. A human-centered design process or a design thinking process is a methodology and approach, and these are specific methods. It's the way that we will work with a community, that we will work with our partners. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Perfect. Yes. So Trista, exactly. In a human-centered design process, you may have participatory methods, but you can also carry out a human-centered design process without as much participation. You decide when putting together the methodology, how much people are involved and in which parts of the process. Okay. So in participatory design, the designer, researcher, public servant is in charge of making sense of the data gathered from the community or other stakeholders' input, right? So there is a hierarchy in this process, and it's important to just be transparent and open about this, right? It works because it works as a sort of funnel in decision-making, where opinions, feelings, information about the community and other actors is compiled. And so this difference is important as it determines how much participation there is, and if there is a reinterpretation of what is needed in the process. And therefore, a participatory process may be faster, but more responsibility relies in the designer or public servants compiling the community's insights as they are channeling that information into the final designer outcome. Okay? So I'll present 2 case studies before wrapping up. I see we have 25 minutes, and then we can chat more about this. So the first one is a bit more qualitative. And the second example regarding New Jersey, the New Jersey Future of Work Task Force will gear towards the use of a technological platform in order to foster participation. So I chose those 2 examples specifically because one is more analog, kind of face-to-face engagement, and the other one leverages technology in order to engage a larger pool of people. So in 2019, I collaborated with the Digital Public Innovation Agency in Mexico City for the development of the city's taxi app. It was a project that involved doing research about the state of affairs of public taxis in the city, doing service design and user experience, user interface for the implementation of the app. And we could have approached the project from a design-focused perspective, since at the end of the day, we were developing a digital platform. However, we took very seriously the importance of including the lived experience of those involved in the use of public taxis in the city. So for context, in Mexico City at the moment, 2019, there were around 140,000 taxis, from which an approximate of 30,000 taxis were considered pirate, So informal, not legalized taxis, they didn't have what would be the equivalent of a medallion. And the Ministry of Transportation did not have a complete database of all the cars and drivers. And it got even more complicated because each car had multiple drivers ranging from 1 to 5 drivers in order to keep the taxi working 24/7, right, to maximize profits. So Mexico City was living high levels of insecurity and violence, especially against women. And in that summer, in the lapse of 2 weeks, there had been 3 femicides. So the murder of women for identifying or being women, and they had been kidnapped on board public taxis. So it became a really pressing issue, mostly for women living in the periphery of the city, who used public taxis as one of the legs in their daily transportation trips towards the center of the city. So we determined there was a need for different levels of engagement and participation to understand the problem, and therefore there were multiple groups we needed to engage. The first group were other public servants and experts from ministries and agencies within the Mexico City government. Then we asked ourselves, well, who are most impacted, with the most impacted groups by unsafe taxi rides? And we decided we would have 2 groups of people we wanted to talk to. Basically, civil society, citizens, residents of the city using taxis, and taxi drivers. And because of the context, we did some work with mixed groups, so where we had men and women, but mainly focused on groups that were composed of only women, and again, that had to take a taxi on their everyday transportation ride or legs. For taxi drivers, we segmented them into senior and junior drivers. And what I mean by that is that senior drivers were people that had been driving a car for 20, 30 years, and for whom an app sounded like something they really did not want to use. Junior drivers were more recent generations, and they drove public taxis for part of their day, and then perhaps for the other part, drove a car linked to a private company. So they felt more comfortable with the idea of adopting an app for their work. We did workshops and group conversations with them, and we got very interesting insights. We distilled those insights and touched base with the Ministry of Transportation to see if that kind of complemented the research that they had been doing in the previous years. And so, for example, we learned that most women used a third-party app like WhatsApp to share their location with family members and friends when on a taxi. On the other hand, taxi drivers also expressed a lot of fear when working, as they were also subjected to a lot of peril and violence. They also used WhatsApp to communicate with other drivers when something came up, when an issue arose. We also learned that there was very little trust in having an emergency button on the app, because both taxi drivers and women considered that if something happened and they pressed the button, no response would be elicited, right? So from that, we created a set of very low resolution prototypes that were printed on paper and shared back with participants in order to see what the main functions of the app would be, what they really wanted to see, what were the basic minimum, like the bare minimum that the app needed to have. And once those functions were determined, we went back to our internal group of public workers, public professionals, and started to see what were the already existing protocols that could be connected to some of those features in the app, and which protocols would need to be developed from scratch. And those protocols entail sometimes coordinating amongst a diversity of public offices and even neighboring states. Finally, we tested the app on the ground. We wanted to make sure that the emergency button, that thing that was really not trustworthy for participants, would actually work and trigger a very newly developed protocol that we had to put in place through this process. So this is a map of Mexico City. We wanted to really serve communities that did not have access to private transportation apps and that lived in non-affluent areas in the periphery of the city with low connectivity and high levels of peril towards women. So we were really trying to set our app in the harshest conditions to test it. The green areas are the zones of the city where private apps operate. So with those parameters in mind, we selected the areas, the gray dots, where we would do the testings, and we collaborated with taxi drivers who drove us around to test the app and mainly the emergency button to make sure that it would always connect to Mexico City's Central Security Center. These are the early prototypes that we used to test the app. As I mentioned, there was an iterative process throughout the whole project. And as you can see, they still have had at that point some glitches that allowed us to go back to the developers and iterate on what needed to be corrected. It is also worth mentioning that the app worked at the end as a mirror, and all the features were also available for taxi drivers, because by working with them, it came to light how many of them faced similar insecurity issues as some of the riders. So the app at the end connected to third-party apps so that digital literacy learning curve was taken care of. We were just using what people knew what to use before. And both riders and taxi drivers had access to just sharing their location via WhatsApp. And that's the final app. Now, this second example is on a participatory process developed by the Future of Work Task Force in the state of New Jersey. And the task force was responsible for understanding the impact of technological developments in the labor and employment landscape. So in 2020, the task force asked New Jersey residents what they felt were the challenges that technology created to the future of work. And from that input, the task force would create a set of recommendations. And I'm just gonna pop the document on the chat because it may be of interest for some of you. You can have it as a resource. So by using a tool that allows to submit ideas and rank them in a very easy sort of voting-like manner, nearly 4,000 people responded and participated on the call. Right? So we're not talking about focus groups with 20 people anymore, 10, 20 people. We're talking about 4,000 people participating. And the large number of participants was a result of collaborating with over 40 community stakeholders and workforce organizations that shared the call. The tool that they used is called All Our Ideas, and I will again put it on the chat so that you can take a look at it later. So through this tool, 166 different problem statements were drafted, and participants were asked to choose which problem was of greater concern in two randomized options that the platform presented. Those were later used as inputs for the task force's recommendations. Also, because New Jersey has a large Spanish-speaking community, the prompts and materials were all translated into Spanish. So, as you can see, considering lived experience as an expertise is a deep change in the way that we define problems and think of solutions, and to the way we really think about our position in relationship or in relation to the communities we serve. Emma Blomkamp in Australia, she's based in Australia, is a co-design expert. And this is her take on lived experience as a form of expertise. Although they may be creative experts in their own lives, many people are likely to need support or facilitation to express themselves and meaningfully participate in co-design. An important part of the co-design process is having a skilled facilitator who can choose the most appropriate tools to enable people to communicate and engage with each other, as well as feel comfortable and inspired enough to envision their own and others' ideas. So there's no kind of tool that will just fit any project. It depends on the context. It depends on how you're putting together a methodology for your projects. Sometimes you may need to use tools like All Our Ideas in order to engage thousands of people, because that's what the project requires. Sometimes it's just talking to small groups of residents in a local part or a neighborhood of your locality, right? It really depends. And I will share the paper from where that quote was taken from as well, so that you can read it if you're more interested about that. All right, so some considerations to conduct an engagement. I think this is a really fantastic resource, the Collective Intelligence Checklist for the Public Sector. It's a guide created by Nesta and the GovLab. And they have put together a checklist just to think on what you need to do when putting together an engagement process, kind of things that you must not forget. And again, I will put the link on the chat since it's a free and open resource for you to have. Here it is. And not only it's an incredible resource, but they also have a flow chart that helps you determine if doing community engagement or participatory processes is the right thing to do. It may not be the right thing always, right? So mainly when working or providing services with communities that have been historically disadvantaged, it is important to avoid participation fatigue just with ongoing requests. So this is helpful to determine in the first place if you actually need to design a participatory process. Kind of takes you through a decision-making pipeline. So the first thing is to articulate the project goals. Have we really thought out what we want to get out of a participatory process? The second one is identifying the right participants. You may want to engage participants at different levels of intensity, right? Some may be more engaged, some may just want to be engaged in a voting session or a focus group from time to time. So not everyone needs to be involved all the time. Do you have the means and possibility to reach to participants you've identified? Who is the right owner for this project, for a participatory or engagement project, right? The project must have an accountable owner who may be inside or outside of government, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be inside of government. It may be a coalition partner, but someone that can kind of take care and steward the project. Have you included incentives for participation? I know some of my colleagues and collaborators, for example, at the Urban Institute, they will not do participatory processes without compensating people or without providing childcare for the time that the session will take place, or for paying for the transportation rides in order to get to the office where the focus group will happen, right? So are those incentives included in the process? Have you defined the tasks? Tasks need to be very well defined so that we know how to proceed throughout the participatory process. And therefore, we establish a workflow. We will first talk to these community members, and then we will create an affinity diagram where we will distill the insights, and then we will circle back to community members or not. We will circle back to, the Ministry of Transportation so that those insights can be validated and we can see how to proceed. Or maybe it's a combination of both, right? So those tasks and that workflow needs to be determined. How will you evaluate inputs? How do we know that the information that we're receiving is actually the quality or the sort of information that we need? We need to set certain metrics and standards in order to know that we are succeeding. And it's fine if we're not succeeding, but we just need to be aware of that so that we can circle back and say, okay, there's things that need to be changed. How will you use the gain insights, right? Because if we ask a community to participate and then we do not use their insights, that can really just chip on the trust that we're building between the office, agency, institution that we're working for and the community, right? And we want to avoid that. We want to avoid just using participation as a token. So these are the 9 points. You can read further on how to proceed for each one of them on the document that I shared on the chat.
Sophia,
Yes.
Trista asking, could you either mention or show numbers 1 through 3 again?
Absolutely, absolutely. So 1, 2, 3 are here. So the first one is, have you articulated the project's goals? So knowing what we want to get at, identified the right participants, right? So for these, perhaps a stakeholder map would help, where we understand who is the community we want to engage with, who are key actors, and then who are we going to be engaging, and why some people, why not some other people, or why everyone, and make those calls. And then can you reach the participants you have identified? Sometimes you may do that through collaborating with local nonprofits, through community groups, through activist groups, right? Trista, I hope this helped. And absolutely, I can share my slides with all of you if that's helpful. So some challenges to consider, because this is not just a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9 step, and that's it, and everything works perfectly, right? So I would love to hear again from you. In developing an engagement process, what are some challenges you think you might face or you've already faced? And we'll give people a second just to answer in the
Kevin
chat.
says researchers' vulnerability.
Kevin, could you elaborate a little bit more on that, on researchers' vulnerability, what you mean by that?
As Kevin answers, we have less engagement than we expected. From Kent, Hannah says not getting a full diverse population. Julianne says lack of involvement, trouble getting participants. Joe says language barriers, lack of funding, distrust from community members based on historical relationships. Trudy says connecting with residents who aren't already highly engaged. Trista says ensuring we are identifying the right participants and being inclusive without diversity bias, quote unquote diversity bias. Rebecca says hostility or derision from some participants that makes others feel like they cannot contribute as well. Yama says lack of rapport with the community or lack of faith from the community being engaged. Max says people in the community who want to engage often feel disconnected from the person conducting the project, you. Manaha says lack of civic engagement, systemic biases that exclude individuals of diverse races and socioeconomic backgrounds. And Ev says your organization may have policies that are more concerned with liability, which diminish the communication process.
Yes.
Thank you all for those.
Thank you. Yes, all of those are very big challenges. And I don't think there is just an answer for some of those challenges. It's things that people doing this sort of work are facing continuously. So yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So just to wrap up, I wanted to share with you another resource that I think is very valuable. This is a guide that people from the Urban Institute put together on how to do community engagement, but really looking at equity and centering equity at the forefront of it. And I believe they explain in this document what I was mentioning before about data walks and how to implement those to make kind of the information that we're compiling more accessible to community members. So I'll just pop that in the chat as well so that you can have it. There you go. And with that, I would love to hear if you have any questions, comments, concerns, so we can have also a more open conversation. My email is there on the slide. Please feel free to reach out at any point if you have any further questions. More than happy to connect. And yes, thank you, Hannah, for the invite.